In the winter of 1931, a woman came home from a cocktail party in London and asked her husband who Arthur Sydgreaves was. But she had overheard that man say his company had recently taken over Bentley, and her husband was Walter Owen Bentley, who had built that company himself. He told her quietly that Arthur Sydgreaves was the managing director of Rolls-Royce. That was how the founder of Bentley Motors learned who had bought it. No one had told him. Not the court, not the receiver, not the men who wrote the check. A company whose name meant nothing to anyone had been circling his life's work. And by the time he found out what that name really stood for, it owned his factory in Cricklewood, his showrooms in Cork Street, the 5 victories at Le Mans, and something he had never imagined could be sold at all. It owned him. If you like the stories that sit just underneath the famous ones, subscribe. There is a great deal in this one that the badge on the bonnet has never admitted to. Chapter 1. The Apprentice Who Paid to Shovel Coal. His father paid £75 so that his son could spend 5 years covered in soot at a railway works in Doncaster. That is where this begins. Not in a showroom, not at Le Mans, and not in a boardroom. It begins with a boy from Hampstead who wanted to be near locomotives so badly that his family bought him the privilege of working on them. Walter Owen Bentley was born on the 16th of September, 1888. Everyone who knew him called him W.O., and almost nobody called him anything else for the next 80 years. In the summer of 1910, he finished a 5-year premium apprenticeship with the Great Northern Railway. A premium apprenticeship was exactly what it sounds like. The family paid the company to take the boy on. £75 was a serious sum of money then, and it bought him the right to be cold, filthy, and exhausted in a machine shop at Doncaster. He loved it. Years later, he could still describe what the sight of a certain locomotive did to him. The engines built by Patrick Stirling, he said, with their single enormous driving wheels standing 8 foot high, could move him profoundly. At the end of his time there, they let him on the footplate as a second fireman on main line expresses. He remembered one day in particular, London to Leeds and back. On the return leg, they ran from Wakefield to King's Cross without stopping, 175 miles in a single unbroken effort, 400 miles in a day, about 7 tons of coal, and every pound of it lifted by hand, by him, into a firebox. His summary of that day was one sentence: not a bad day's exercise. Hold on to that sentence because it explains the whole man. He was not describing an ordeal. He was describing a pleasure. This was somebody whose satisfaction came from machinery working properly and from his own body being used hard in the service of it. Money does not appear anywhere in the story he told about that day. Money would not appear anywhere in the story he told about anything, and that is precisely the flaw that would eventually cost him everything he made. He decided the railways would not give him enough room, and he left. He studied theoretical engineering at King's College London. He took a job with the National Motor Cab Company, where, among other duties, he oversaw the maintenance of a fleet of 250 unique cabs. What fascinated him there was not the engineering. It was the drivers. He was quietly delighted by the ingenuity the cabbies showed in fiddling their meters. There is something revealing in that. He admired cleverness, even when it was being used against his employer. He never seems to have thought of it as a warning. He raced motorcycles in 1909 and 1910, on a Quadrant, on a Rex, and then as a member of the Indian factory team. He rode in 2 Isle of Man tourist trophy races and finished neither of them. In 1910, his rear tyre burst on the second lap. This is not the record of a natural champion. It is the record of a man learning, at speed, what breaks and why. Then in 1912 came the decision that made everything else possible. He joined his brother, Horace Milner Bentley, in a firm called Bentley and Bentley. They sold a French car, the Doriot Flandrin et Parent, known to everybody as the DFP. It was a perfectly decent car, and it was not fast enough. Bentley was certain that the way to sell motor cars was to win races in them. So he needed more from the DFP engine, and there was no more to be had. Its pistons were of the conventional heavy type of the period. Heavy pistons limit how fast an engine can safely turn, and they carry heat badly. And then there was a paperweight. It was aluminium. It was light, and it was strong enough, and it moved heat well. He looked at that ordinary object and thought about the inside of an engine. That is the moment. Everything that follows in this story, 5 victories at Le Mans, a house in Surrey with a public house in its basement, a bankruptcy, a concealed bidder, a courtroom fight over his own surname. All of it comes out of a man in 1912 noticing a piece of metal and asking a question nobody else had thought to ask. He had pistons made in aluminium alloy. He modified the camshaft. And the DFP, that pleasant, ordinary French car, went to Brooklands and took records in 1913 and again in 1914. He had found the thing he was better at than almost anyone alive. Then war came, and the world he had found it in ended. Chapter 2. The war made his engines and his money. The Navy gave him a team, a factory in Coventry, and permission to build the engine he had been arguing for. Bentley understood immediately what his aluminium pistons meant in wartime. An aero engine with light alloy pistons ran cooler. It could take a higher compression ratio. It could turn faster and give more power without tearing itself apart. In 1914, that was not a commercial advantage. It was the difference between a pilot coming home and a pilot not coming home. He could not simply publish the idea. Security forbade it. So he went to the official liaison between the engine manufacturers and the Navy, a man called Commander Wilfred Briggs, who would remain his senior officer for the rest of the war. Briggs took one look at what Bentley knew and told him he needed to be in uniform. Commissioned into the Royal Naval Air Service, Bentley was sent round the British engine industry to give away his own best idea. His first stop was Rolls-Royce, where he sat down with the man who would later be Lord Hives. The result was that the first aero engine Rolls-Royce ever built, the Eagle, was designed with aluminium pistons instead of cast iron or steel. Remember that. Walter Owen Bentley walked into Rolls-Royce and handed them the thing that made their first aero engine work. He went on to Louis Coattelin at Sunbeam, and the same innovation went into all their aero engines. Then he went to Gwyn's, whose factory at Chiswick was building French Clerget engines under license. And here he ran into a wall. He was liaising between the squadrons in France and the engineers in West London, and he could see what the Clerget needed. Gwyn's would not do it, so the Navy simply gave him his own team and a factory. He designed his own engine at the Humber Works in Coventry. They called it the BR1 for Bentley Rotary. It was fundamentally different from the Clerget in almost every respect, except for the cam mechanism, which he kept purely because it made the thing easier to manufacture in a hurry. That detail is worth noticing. Even at the height of his own vindication, he was thinking about the factory floor. A prototype was running by the early summer of 1916. A bigger version, the BR2, followed in early 1918. In 1920, the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors invited him to make a claim for what his design work had been worth to the country. The firms holding the Clerget license contested it. They lost. The commission awarded Walter Owen Bentley £8,000. That was the money. There was no inheritance, no backer, no city syndicate. The capital that founded one of the most admired motor companies in British history was a government payment for an aeroplane engine, given to an engineer who had spent the war telling other people how to do their jobs better. Bentley Motors Limited was formed in January 1919, with his brother alongside him. He brought in Frank Burgess, who had come from Humber, and Harry Varley from Vauxhall. Clive Gallop joined to help with the engine. They took small premises in London, and the first Bentley engine, a 3-litre 4-cylinder, ran for the first time in a Muse workshop off Baker Street. There is a plaque on that building today. His stated ambition for the company fitted in a single line: to build a good car, a fast car, the best in class. The first complete Bentley began road tests in January 1920. The first production car was delivered in September 1921, built at a works in Cricklewood, about 6 miles out from the centre of London. Chassis frames came down from Meccans of Glasgow. A Bentley left Cricklewood as a bare rolling chassis and went on to a coach builder who would build the body to the customer's order. That is how expensive cars were made then, and it is why the price of a Bentley was never really the price of a Bentley. The reputation came fast, and it came from racing, exactly as he had predicted back when he was fitting aluminium pistons to a French tourer. In 1922, a lone 3-litre went to the Indianapolis 500, driven by Douglas Hawkes, and finished 13th at an average of 74.95 miles an hour. In the Tourist Trophy that same year, with W.O. driving one of the cars himself, Bentley was the only team to finish. They took the team award, and that result put the name into the mouths of everybody who cared about motor cars. Not everybody was flattering about them. Ettore Bugatti, who built the most delicate and beautiful racing machinery in Europe, is said to have called Bentleys the fastest lorries in the world. He meant it as contempt. The British took it as a compliment and have been repeating it for 100 years because it was true in the way that mattered. Bentleys were heavy and they were strong, and they did not stop. Bugatti had accidentally written the finest advertisement the company ever had. By the middle of the 1920s, the name was made. The books, however, were another matter entirely, and the man who would come to fix them had been born into a fortune that began with a boy being laughed off a stage in the East End of London. Chapter 3. The Diamond Fortune That Arrived in a Nursery. A boy in Whitechapel took his surname from an audience that jeered him off a stage and turned it into a mine. His name was Barnett Isaacs. His father, Isaac Isaacs, dealt in second-hand clothes in Petticoat Lane. The two sons, Harry and Barnett, helped in the business and earned extra money street trading, mostly apples, and juggling. The local community organised an entertainment, and Barnett decided to play Othello. He was a slim, fair-haired boy who wore pince-nez spectacles, which made him an unlikely choice for the part, and the audience thought he was playing for laughs. They jeered him in delight. He walked off the stage in tears. At the end of the evening, the performers came out to take their bows, and Barnett refused to go on. The audience began chanting for him. "Barnett too," they shouted. "Barnett too." From that night, the brothers were the Barnett Two brothers, and in time, the name settled into Barnato, a surname taken from mockery. He would spend the rest of his life proving that the crowd had been wrong about him, and he would die, still trying. Diamonds had been found on the Orange River in 1867. Harry went out to South Africa in 1871. Barney followed 2 years later, in 1873, carrying capital of £50 and 40 boxes of cheap cigars that an uncle had given him. The port was 300 miles from the diamond fields. He paid a cattle drover £3 to let him walk the whole way with the herd, sleeping under a wagon at night. When he finally reached Kimberley, he found his brother sleeping rough in a tent. Every letter Harry had sent home about making a fortune had been untrue. What Barney did next was the making of him. The diggers sifted the loose soil for stones, and when they hit the hard blue ground beneath it, they gave up and abandoned the claim, because everyone knew the blue ground was the bottom. Barney bought those abandoned claims. With the few diamonds he found, he bought more, and when he had enough of them, he brought in machinery and mined the blue ground itself. His first mine was the Primrose. Over the next 20 years, he became one of the richest men on earth. His holdings were amalgamated with those of Cecil Rhodes in 1888 to form De Beers Consolidated Mines, and the cheque written to settle it was, by every account, larger than any cheque anyone had written before. The figure is variously given as £4 million and as £5,338,650. The accounts do not agree, and there is no reason to pretend otherwise. What is certain is that it was an amount of money nobody in England had a mental category for. He became a life governor of De Beers, a member of the Cape Assembly for Kimberley, and a lieutenant of the City of London. The street trader from Petticoat Lane had arrived. He also brought 3 nephews into the business, Jack, Wolf, and Solly Joel, and that decision may have killed him. In early June 1897, Barney boarded a ship at Cape Town for England with his wife and their 3 children. His nephew, Solly Joel, travelled with them. On the 14th of June, off Madeira, by some accounts about a day south of it, Barney Barnato went over the side and drowned. He was on deck with Solly at the time. There was talk of a struggle. The official conclusion was suicide, and there is a case for it. He had been under enormous strain. The speculative boom in South African shares had broken the previous year, and his mental state in 1897 worried those close to him. There is also a case for something worse, and it has to be stated carefully. Earlier that year, an irregularity had been found in the company's accounts, running to more than £1 million, and the audit pointed at Solly Joel. Long afterwards, when Barney's family finally forced the books into open court, it was established that Solly had indeed been taking money from Barney and from the company over a long period. The case collapsed into a settlement on the first afternoon of the trial, £960,000, with interest calculated across 30 years on top. So there are 3 explanations for what happened off Madeira. He jumped, he fell, or he was helped. The official conclusion was the first. The record leaves room for the other 2 and settles neither, and this film is not going to pretend otherwise. A man went into the Atlantic, and the sea kept the answer. What matters for this story is what he left behind. His son Wolf was 1 year old. Woolf Barnato had been born on the 27th of September, 1895, at Spencer House in St. James's Place, a great Palladian house built in 1752 for Lord Spencer. 2 generations earlier, his family had been selling old coats in Petticoat Lane. Now a diamond fortune, made 6,000 miles away by a man, laughed off a stage, sat waiting for a child in a nursery in the most fashionable address in England. He would grow up to spend a great deal of it on motor cars, and the man whose motor cars he would spend it on was at that moment a schoolboy in Hampstead who liked locomotives. Chapter 4. The rescue that made him an employee. By 1925, the company bearing his name was failing, and the man who saved it wanted control of it. The problem was never the cars, it was arithmetic. Bentley Motors sold small numbers of very expensive machines, built to a standard that the price could not quite carry. The 3-litre open 4-seater was advertised at £1,225 in 1923, and on top of the chassis price, a buyer paid a coach builder for a body, which could add hundreds more. Every car took time, care, and skilled labour, and every racing season took a great deal more. The victories that made the name were bought with money the company did not have. By 1925, Bentley Motors was in real danger of going under. It had existed for 6 years. Woolf Barnato by then was 29, and he was a great deal more than rich. He had come out of the war, a captain in the Royal Field Artillery, having served in France and the Middle East, and risen from the ranks. He was a serious sportsman. He played cricket for Surrey. He was a scratch golfer. He boxed. And he had been racing motor cars since 1921, working his way through a Locomobile, a Calthorpe, an Austro-Daimler, a Talbot that had belonged to Malcolm Campbell, an Ansoldo, a Wolseley, a Hispano-Suiza, and a Bugatti before he ever drove a Bentley. He was, in other words, the ideal owner. He loved the product, he understood it from the driver's seat, and he could afford it. Bentley and Barnato met in 1925. Barnato agreed to provide finance. Through his holding company, Barrowmans, the initial commitment was in excess of £100,000, and it saved the company and everybody working in it. The finance was agreed in 1925, and the chairmanship followed. Read the next sentence slowly, because it is the quiet centre of the entire story. From that point on, Walter Owen Bentley continued his design work as Woolf Barnato's employee. There was no dramatic scene, no confrontation, no signature at midnight, no betrayal. A man with money rescued a company that was drowning, and in exchange he took control of it, which is what anybody would have done and what any accountant would have advised. The name over the door stayed the same. The engineer stayed at his bench. Everything looked exactly as it had looked the week before, but the founder was now staff. He appears to have accepted it without complaint, and the reason lies in his character. He had no wish to run a company. He wanted to design engines. The board could have the meetings. The chairman could have the chair. As long as the drawing office was his and the cars carried his standards, Bentley seems to have regarded the arrangement as a fair trade. And for a while it was. For a few years it worked beautifully. Barnato was not an absentee financier who appeared twice a year to complain about the figures. He was at the circuits. He was in the cars. Between 1925 and 1928, with a series of co-drivers, he set 28 speed records, over distances running from 50 kilometres to 3,000, and over periods from a single hour to a full 24. Most were set at the Montlhéry Autodrome south of Paris. A chairman who spends his weekends driving his own product round a banked track for 24 hours at a time is not the worst chairman an engineer could be given. But the money kept going in, and it kept going in on a schedule. There was a further injection in 1927, another in 1928, and another in 1929, each of them tens of thousands of pounds, each of them going into a company that had never repaid a penny of the one before. No business survives that pattern indefinitely, and with every year that passed, the man writing the cheques had more reason to ask what exactly he was buying. The trouble with being an employee, though, is that employees can be overruled. And the board of a company that is losing money looks for reasons, and the reasons it finds tend to be the man who insists on building things properly. The company's board of directors had been critical of Bentley even before the rescue. He was the engineer who would not compromise. He wanted cars strong enough to run for 24 hours flat out at Le Mans and then be driven home. That is expensive. It is also exactly what made a Bentley, which is a circle the board never managed to square. The clearest example came in 1929, and it involved a car that is now the most famous Bentley ever built. Sir Henry Birkin, called Tim by everybody, was the purest racer among the men who drove for the company. He was convinced that the 4.5 litre needed a supercharger, force more air into the engine, get more power out of it, beat the faster foreign cars on the straights. Bentley was against it, and his objection was engineering, not pride. He believed that forcing induction on that particular engine would wreck its reliability, and reliability was the whole basis of the company's success. His cars won long races because they finished them. Barnato approved the project anyway. The decision that followed settled the question of where the power now sat. The supercharged car, the blower, was developed in separate, purpose-built workshops at Welwyn Garden City, away from Cricklewood, away from Bentley, and away from his design office. The most celebrated car ever to wear his name was deliberately built out of his sight by his own company, against his stated engineering judgment. Think about the practical arrangements that required. Somebody had to find the premises. Somebody had to move men and tools out of Cricklewood and set up a second engineering operation in another town. That is not an accident of scheduling. That is a company deliberately building a car where its own chief engineer could not watch it being built. 54 supercharged cars were made. Bentley was right about them. The blower never won a major race. There is no record of him making a scene about it. That was never his way, and in any case there was nowhere left to make one. The drawings could be overruled. The chairman had the votes. He had founded the company on £8,000 of his own award money. He had put his name on the radiator, his standards into every chassis, and his reputation behind every claim. And now a car was being built in another town, by other men, in defiance of his advice, and there was nothing whatever he could do about it. The money had arrived in 1925, and it had saved everything. It had also, without anyone quite noticing, changed who this company belonged to. To see what that money actually looked like when it was standing still, you have to go to a house in Surrey, where the chauffeur outranked everybody. Chapter 5. The house where the chauffeur outranked the butler. In the basement of a Surrey country house, there was a mock Tudor public house, so that the party never had to end. It was called the Ardenrun Arms. It was not a cellar with a barrel in it. It was a fitted bar, built into the basement of a gentleman's country seat, so that the guests would never be forced to stop drinking merely because the licensed premises of Surrey had closed. That single amenity tells you almost everything about the house above it. The house was Ardenrun Place, near Blindley Heath and Lingfield in Surrey. It was designed by Ernest Newton, one of the most respected domestic architects of the Edwardian period, and built for an industrialist named Hans Henry Koenig, who held it from 1909 until 1921. The design work belongs to 1905 or 1906, and the house was finished by 1909. A contemporary architectural notice described it in terms that are almost unbearable to read now. A pleasant specimen of a country house, it said. It makes no pretense of being older than it is. It looks well already, and, given proper upkeep, should look better as the years go on, given proper upkeep. The house had 24 years left. Woolf Barnato bought Ardenrun in 1921, when he was 25 years old, with 1,000 acres of land around it. Consider what he installed there, and what it says about the mind of a young man with a diamond fortune and no father to answer to. There was a private golf course. There was a home farm. There was a stable block. And there was garaging for a great many motor cars. On the lower lawns there were cricket practice nets. In the basement there was the public house. And the entire estate was run under the supervision of the head chauffeur, a man named Cyril de Home. That last detail is the one to hold on to, because it is stranger than it looks. In the ordinary British country house of that period, the senior figure below stairs was the butler, or in the grandest establishments, the house steward. Beneath him ran a rigid order that everybody in service understood without being told. The housekeeper commanded the female staff. The cook ruled the kitchen. Footmen were chosen partly for their height and appearance. Ladies' maids and valets outranked housemaids. The hall boy was at the bottom and knew it. The whole architecture of such a house was designed to keep this population invisible, moving through service corridors and back stairs so that the family and their guests would never encounter the machinery that fed and warmed them. The chauffeur, in that world, belonged to the garage. He was a modern intruder, a mechanic in a peaked cap, and he ranked well below the men who served at table. At Ardenrun, the chauffeur ran the estate. Nothing states more plainly what kind of house this was. It was not an inherited seat operating on inherited rules. There was no tenantry in the old sense, no dynastic obligation, no ancestors in the local church. It was a new fortunes country house, bought outright at 25, and arranged from top to bottom around a hobby. The motor cars were the point. So the man who looked after the motor cars was the man who mattered. The Bentley Boys came down from London to enjoy it. They were a loose group of wealthy amateurs who drove the company's cars, funded them, and gave the marque its entire public character. Barnato was one. Tim Birkin was another. So were Glenn Kidston, Dr. Dudley Bengerfield, Bernard Rubin, Jack and Clive Dunphy, Sammy Davis, Jack Barclay and Frank Clement. Several of them kept flats in Grosvenor Square in London, in adjoining buildings, and the corner became known as Bentley Corner for the number of the cars standing outside it. Birkin and Rubin lived in adjoining townhouses in the square. They were, in the language of the newspapers of the day, exactly the sort of young men the newspapers of the day enjoyed writing about. At Ardenrun, they had a proper playground. The approach ran down a long drive from Tandridge Lane, and the straight stretch towards Moat Farm was about half a mile. That is where they raced each other. On one occasion, the guests were racing Bugattis. Ettore Bugatti, the man who had called their cars the fastest lorries in the world, was a great friend of Barnato's, and he brought several of his own machines down to Surrey. The party then took turns driving them against the clock, from the front of the house to Tandridge Lane and back again. In 1930, the Surrey County cricket team came to visit, Jack Hobbs and Percy Fender among them. The Australian touring side came too, with Don Bradman in it. Barnato's daughter kept an autograph book with the signatures of both teams in it. The gardener looked after the cricket pitch. So there it is, in one corner of Surrey in 1930. 1,000 acres, a golf course, a bar in the cellar, Don Bradman's signature in a girl's autograph book, Bugattis being timed down the drive, and somewhere in the middle of it, a young man who had inherited all of this before he could walk, because his father went over the side of a ship off Madeira. None of this was paid for by Bentley Motors. All of it was paid for by diamonds. And that is the arrangement the whole enterprise rested on, though hardly anybody outside the boardroom understood it. The most admired sporting motor cars in Britain were not being funded by the people who bought them. They were being funded by the man who owned this house, out of a fortune dug from a hole in the Northern Cape, which was perfectly sustainable right up until the moment it was not. Chapter 6. 5 wins that paid for nothing. 1 hour into the 1927 race, the entire Bentley team lay wrecked at a corner called White House. To understand what Le Mans meant to this company, start with what it demanded. 24 hours. Cars driven flat out through a full day and a full night on public roads, with the mechanical failures of ordinary motoring compressed into a single unbroken assault. No manufacturer could fake a result there. Either the car lasted, or it did not. Bentley won it 5 times. The first came in 1924, when John Duff and Frank Clement took a 3-litre to victory and became the first British constructor to win the race. It was the perfect proof of everything Bentley had been saying since he fitted aluminium pistons to a French tourer 12 years earlier. Build it strong, and it will still be running when the delicate machinery has gone home. 1925 was a humiliation. 2 Bentleys entered, neither finished. Then came 1927, and the race that made the legend. An hour in, at a corner known as White House, the Bentley team ran into catastrophe. A pile-up took the cars out, one after another. Of the entire works entry, one car could still move. It was number 7, in the hands of Dr. Dudley Bengerfield and Sammy Davis, and it was badly damaged. They patched it up at the roadside. They put it back into the race. They ran it to the end, in a car that had been in a serious accident against opposition that had not. They won. That car is old number 7, and it is the most celebrated result in the company's history, earned by a machine that had already been wrecked once and would still not stop. 1928 went to Woolf Barnato and Bernard Rubin in a 4.5 litre. 1929 went to Barnato and Tim Birkin in a Speed 6, and Bentley took the first 4 places, filling the entire podium and the position behind it, which no manufacturer had ever done in the history of the race. 1930 went to Barnato and Glenn Kidston, again in a Speed 6. Barnato entered Le Mans 3 times. He won 3 times. He never lost it. Bentley himself, who had every reason to be sour about the man who now held the chair, called Barnato the best driver they ever had, and in his judgment, the best British driver of his day. That is not a courtesy. Bentley did not pay courtesies about engineering or about driving, and Barnato's record away from Le Mans was extraordinary in its own right. Between 1925 and 1928, with a series of co-drivers, he set 28 speed records, over distances from 50 kilometres up to 3,000 kilometres, and over periods ranging from 1 hour to a full 24. Most of them were set at the Montlhéry Autodrome south of Paris. That is a man who was not merely paying for the team. He was the best asset the team had. Now hold that glorious picture in your mind and look at what was underneath it. Here are the numbers the public never saw. In 1928, the second of the 4 consecutive Le Mans wins, Bentley Motors built 417 chassis. That was its best year. Total production across the entire life of the Cricklewood Company came to 3,061 chassis. 1,639 3 litres, 733 4.5 litres, of which 54 were the supercharged blowers, 539, 6.5 litres, of which 171 were Speed 6s, 50 of the 4 litre, 100 of the 8 litre. 3,061 chassis across the whole life of the firm is what a mass manufacturer of the period would turn out in a few days. And the racing did not pay for itself. Racing has never paid for itself. A works team at Le Mans is a marketing expense, and a very large one, covering transport, spares, engines built to a higher specification than any customer would receive, mechanics, testing, and the outright loss of expensive machinery and accidents. Think about what 1927 alone must have cost. A team of cars taken across the Channel and down to the Sarthe, every one of them destroyed or damaged at White House Corner inside the first hour. Mechanics working at the roadside on the single survivor. One car came home under its own power, and every one of those machines had been built to a racing standard no customer ever paid for. What the company got out of that day was worth more than a trophy. It got proof, delivered in front of the world's press, that a Bentley could be smashed and still finish a 24-hour race. No advertisement in Britain could buy that. But proof is not income, and the men in the accounts office at Cricklewood still had to find the money for the lorries. In a normal company, that expense comes out of trading profit. It is a slice of the money the business makes selling things. Bentley Motors was not making that money. The racing budget was coming, in the end, out of one man's private fortune, and behind him, there was nothing. So the 5 victories at Le Mans, the most admired sporting record in Britain, the thing that made the name worth having at all, were being bought with diamond money from Kimberley. Every cheer at Le Mans was, in the strictest accounting sense, a cost. The public saw a great national marque beating the French and the Italians at their own game. The board saw a set of figures that did not close. Both were looking at the same cars. And in March 1930, with the company sliding, the chairman went to the south of France and made a bet. Chapter 7. He beat a train to London and lost the company anyway. He bet £200 at a dinner party near Cannes that he could reach London before the train reached Calais. The Blue Train was the fashionable way to travel between the Channel and the Mediterranean. It ran from Calais to Cannes, carrying the sort of people who wintered in the south, and it was fast, comfortable, and rather proud of itself. At a dinner party near Cannes in March 1930, somebody raised the subject of the train's performance. Barnato was unimpressed. No great shakes, he called it. And then he made his wager. He would drive his Speed 6 from Cannes, and he would be in London before the train reached Calais. £200 in most accounts, 100 in others. The sum was never the point. Car and train left Cannes together at 5:45 in the evening. With Dale Bourne beside him, Barnato drove north through the night, up the length of France, on the roads of 1930, in a large, heavy motor car with the brakes and the lighting of 1930. The conditions were brutal. This was the length of France on the roads of 1930 at night in March, in a large, heavy motor car that had to keep running the entire way. There was no margin anywhere in it. A single mechanical failure, a single wrong turn, and the wager was lost, and the story would never have been told. He reached the coast. He crossed the Channel on a packet steamer. He was waved through customs on the English side. Then he drove on into London and parked the Speed 6 outside the Conservative Club in St James's Street. The train reached Calais a few minutes later. Some accounts say 4 minutes, others say 8. The sources have been arguing about it ever since, and the argument itself is the tribute. The passengers on that train got to London about 4 hours after he did. It was the last great flourish of the whole Bentley era, and it has been retold ever since as the perfect image of the Bentley Boys. Money, nerve, a beautiful machine, and a completely pointless act of will performed at enormous speed. Notice what the story is actually about, though, once the glamour is set aside. A man at a dinner party is told that something is fast. He disagrees. He then spends a full day and night of his own life and an unknown amount of his own money proving a stranger wrong about a railway timetable. That is the temperament that had been holding Bentley Motors up for 5 years. Not calculation, not strategy. A refusal to be told that something could not be done, funded from a fortune deep enough that the cost never had to be considered. Now set the ledger beside it. By the time Barnato parked outside his club that afternoon, he had put the following into Bentley Motors. In excess of £100,000 through Barrowmans at the start, £35,000 taken as a debenture in July 1927, £40,000 in 1928, £25,000 in 1929, and underneath all of it, the thing that would actually decide the company's fate, his personal guarantee of its mortgage obligations. Look at the rhythm of those figures. 1927, 1928, 1929. Every year. In the years of the greatest triumphs the company ever had, the years of the 4 consecutive Le Mans victories, money was going in from outside every single year to keep the doors open. The victories and the injections are the same list of dates. That is the whole problem, stated in numbers. And there was no second source, no bank facility of any size, no share issue, no consortium. One man, one fortune, one signature. A company with a single point of failure, and the point of failure was a private individual's continuing enthusiasm. Barnato gave up racing after his third Le Mans win in 1930. He was 34. He had won the greatest endurance race in the world every time he had entered it, and he stopped. That is not a small detail, and it sits very close to the heart of this story. A man does not walk away from something he is the best in the world at unless something else has changed. He had beaten the Blue Train that March. He had won Le Mans for the third time that same year. And then he put the helmet down and never raced again. 16 months later, he would tell the lenders he could not meet the debts. The enthusiasm and the money were the same thing, and both of them went out at roughly the same time. Meanwhile, something had happened across the Atlantic that would take about a year to arrive in England. The New York stock market had broken in October 1929. The luxury motor trade does not react immediately to a financial crash. Orders already placed are honoured. Cars already commissioned are completed. Rich men do not become poor overnight, and the very rich take a while to admit that anything has changed. The effect reaches a firm like Bentley Motors with a delay of roughly a year. Which brings us to October 1930, and to the finest motorcar Walter Owen Bentley ever designed. He launched it into the exact month the money died. Chapter 8. The car that was too good to survive. He priced it at £1,850, deliberately, just above the most expensive car Rolls-Royce made. The 8-litre was announced in October 1930. It was the largest and most expensive chassis manufactured in Britain that year, and it was aimed with complete precision at one target. Rolls-Royce sold the Phantom II. It was the definitive British luxury car, and its position at the top of the market had never been seriously challenged by a British rival. Bentley set his chassis price slightly above it. That was not carelessness, and it was not vanity. In the carriage trade, price is a statement of rank. By pricing the 8-litre above the Phantom II, Bentley Motors announced that its car was the better one, and then supported the claim with performance the Rolls-Royce could not match. For a man who had spent his life avoiding commerce, it was an astonishingly aggressive commercial act. He had spent 11 years building strong, fast cars for men who wanted to race them. Now he had built the finest carriage in the country and put it above Rolls-Royce in the price list, in public, in print. 100 were sold. Set that against the competition at that altitude. Ettore Bugatti, at almost exactly the same moment, was offering the Royale, the most extravagant motor car ever conceived. He sold 3. By the standards of that market, in those 2 years, selling 108 litres was a triumph. Bentley had done the thing his board had spent 5 years asking for. He had built a car for the richest customers in the world, and they had bought it. And it destroyed him, for 2 reasons that arrived at once. The first reason was the calendar. Here is what happened to Bentley's output as the Depression came ashore. 417 chassis in 1928, 397 in 1929, 264 in 1930, 206 in 1931. The company lost more than half its production in 3 years, and it did so while carrying the fixed costs of a works at Cricklewood, a service station at Kingsbury, and showrooms in Cork Street. The market for cars costing well over £1,000 before a body was fitted did not shrink politely. It fell away. Every month of 1931, there were fewer men in Britain who could sign that cheque without thinking, and the ones who remained were thinking. And remember how these cars were sold. A Bentley left Cricklewood as a bare chassis with an engine in it. The customer then went to a coach builder and commissioned a body, which could add several £100s more. Buying one was a project undertaken by a man confident about his own future. 1931 was not a year in which wealthy Englishmen felt confident about their own futures. Orders that would once have been placed on a whim were postponed, and a postponed order in that trade is a cancelled one. They tried to reach downwards. The 4 Litre was a cheaper model, and 50 were built in 1931. It was too small a move made too late, aimed at a market that was contracting faster than the company could steer. The second reason was the tax system, and it had been working against Bentley from the beginning. British motor taxation was levied on the horsepower rating calculated by the Royal Automobile Club, a formula derived from the bore of the cylinders and how many of them there were. It took no account of how a car was actually used or how efficient it was. It simply punished large engines year after year for being large. Every big British motor car of the era therefore carried a standing annual penalty that a small one did not, purely as a function of its design. Bentley built nothing but big engines. The entire company was, in the eyes of the Exchequer, a taxable extravagance. And there was one more drain, entirely self-inflicted. Money and engineering attention had gone into the supercharged 4.5 litre that Bentley had opposed, built in a separate factory at Welwyn Garden City. 54 cars, a great deal of development, no major victory. In a company with cash to spare, that would have been an expensive experiment. In a company being kept alive by annual injections from its chairman, it was a wound. So consider the position at the end of 1930. A company producing half what it had produced 2 years earlier. A tax regime penalizing the only kind of car it knew how to build. Cash gone into a supercharged failure, accumulated losses climbing, a single private backer holding the whole structure up, and its finest product sitting in the showroom at £1,850, priced above the Phantom II, outperforming the Phantom II, and being noticed by exactly the people at Derby who had the most to lose from it. Bentley had built a car so good that it made his company dangerous. There was no version of the following year in which Rolls-Royce ignored what was happening at Cricklewood. And there is a bitter symmetry in the two firms' positions that autumn. Rolls-Royce had built its name on refinement, on silence, on the idea that its cars were the best-made objects in the world. Bentley had built his on strength and speed, and finishing races that broke other machines. For 11 years, those had been 2 different businesses serving 2 different kinds of customer. The 8 Litre ended that. Here was a Bentley grand enough for the richest customers in the country, priced above the Phantom II and faster than it. It went straight into the one part of the market Rolls-Royce regarded as its own, and it did so at a moment when there were fewer buyers in that market than at any time in living memory. 2 firms were now chasing the same shrinking group of very rich men. One of them was solvent. He had, without any idea he was doing it, painted a target on his own building. And in July 1931, 2 envelopes arrived that made it possible for somebody to fire at it. Chapter 9. 2 payments he could not make. In July 1931, 2 mortgage payments fell due, and the man who had guaranteed them said he could not pay. This is the moment the company died, and it deserves to be told slowly, because nothing dramatic happens in it. There is no crash, no scandal, no fire. There is a due date and a word from a guarantor. The structure was this. Bentley Motors had mortgage obligations. Woolf Barnato had personally guaranteed them. That guarantee was the reason lenders had been comfortable, and it was the reason the company had survived the previous 5 years. As long as Barnato stood behind the debt was good, because Barnato was good for it. In July 1931, 2 payments came due. Barnato informed the lenders that he was unable to meet these debts. Whether that was a statement of fact or a decision is a question that has never been settled, and it is the most interesting question in this story. What had ended was his willingness to keep writing checks into a business that had never once repaid him. Look at it from his chair. 6 years. In excess of £100,000 at the start, then 35,000 more, then 40,000, then 25,000. A world depression underway. Production halved, and a product range built entirely around large engines in a country that taxed large engines. Any competent advisor would have told him to stop, and he stopped. He was 35 years old, and he had already put more into that company than it had ever been worth. The machinery moved quickly after that. The mortgagee was the London Life Association Limited, and it applied to the court. On the 10th of July, 1931, on the application of the mortgagee, the court appointed a receiver to Bentley Motors Limited. The company went into voluntary liquidation. That is the entire ending. A 10th of July. An application. An appointment. Notice who is absent from that sentence. A life insurance company applied to a court, and a court appointed an official, and between them they ended the most admired sporting marque in Britain. Nobody in that process had ever built a motor car. Nobody in it had stood at White House Corner in 1927. The London Life Association was owed money and was entitled to be paid, and the law provided the mechanism, and the mechanism worked exactly as it was designed to. This is how things of that kind actually end. Not with a decision anybody remembers making, with a date, a form, and an appointment. Now the accounts, laid out plainly, because the scale of the failure is genuinely startling for a marque of this reputation. Bentley Motors had accumulated losses of £136,220. Across its 12 years, it had worked its way through 3 separate fortunes, including Barnato's. It had built 3,061 chassis. It had won the 24 Hours of Le Mans 5 times, in 1924, 1927, 1928, 1929, and 1930. It had taken the first 4 places in a single race, and it had never established a durable profit in any of those years. Read that list again, and notice the shape of it. Every triumph in it is real. Every one of them was paid for by somebody else. For Walter Owen Bentley, the 10th of July 1931 meant something specific and awful. A receiver takes control of the assets. Everything the company owns is now a thing to be valued, listed, and sold to satisfy creditors. The drawings, the tools, the machines at Cricklewood, the unsold chassis, the showrooms in Cork Street, the service station at Kingsbury, the aluminium piston that came out of a paperweight on a desk in 1912 was now an item on an inventory. He was 42. He had built the finest sporting motor cars in the country. He had won at Le Mans 5 times, and every physical thing he had made was about to be valued by a stranger and sold to whoever wanted it. His own position in that summer was stark, and people tend to assume a founder in this situation is at least consulted. He was an employee, and had been since Barnato took the chair. The man who had guaranteed the debts had declined to meet them, and that was a decision taken elsewhere, by somebody else, about money that was not Bentley's and never had been. There is a particular cruelty in the timing of it. 9 months earlier, he had launched the 8 Litre, the best car of his life. 16 months earlier, his chairman had beaten a train across France in one of his Speed 6s. 2 years earlier, 4 of his cars had filled the first 4 places at Le Mans. None of that appeared anywhere on the receiver's inventory, because none of it could be sold. There was one consolation, and to him it must have looked like a good one. The receivership did not mean the marque was finished. A company in receivership can be bought. The Bentley name, the works, the engineering and the racing record still had genuine value, and everybody in the British motor industry knew it. A receivership is a pause rather than a funeral. The receiver takes hold of the assets, stops the bleeding, and looks for the best price he can get for what remains. If a buyer comes forward with enough money and a plan, the factory reopens, the men go back to their benches, and the badge carries on. So through that summer, there was still a version of the future in which all of this ended reasonably well. Somebody would want this. And in the autumn of 1931, somebody did. A serious buyer came forward with the money, the factories, and the ambition to make it work. His name was in the newspapers by October, and it was not Rolls-Royce. Chapter 10. The newspapers said the deal was done. On the 24th of October, the Times reported that Napier had agreed to take over Bentley Motors. Napier, properly D. Napier and Son, had a history to match anything at Cricklewood. Before the First World War, they had been among the most respected motor manufacturers in Britain, and in the years since they had become one of the great aero-engine firms. They had left car manufacture behind. Now they wanted to come back. To return to the luxury car business, a firm needs two things it cannot manufacture quickly. It needs a design of proven quality, and it needs a name that customers already trust. Buying that takes a decade or an act of extraordinary luck. Bentley Motors, sitting in receivership in the autumn of 1931, offered both in one transaction. A design office that had just produced the 8 Litre, a racing record no British marque could equal, and a badge that meant something to every wealthy man in the country. Napier entered negotiations to buy the company. Walter Owen Bentley himself was part of those discussions, and the intended result was a car that would carry both names, a Napier Bentley. Try to imagine how that felt to him after the summer he had endured. He had watched his company put into a receiver's hands in July. Now, in October, a substantial and well-financed engineering firm wanted to buy it, restart it, and keep him in it. His designs would be built. The name would live. He would have work and a drawing office and something to do with the next 20 years. It was, on paper, the best possible outcome for everybody. Napier got a design office and a badge. The creditors got their money. The workforce at Cricklewood got their jobs. And the engineer got to carry on being an engineer in a company that wanted him for exactly the thing he was good at. There was a certain symmetry to it too. Napier had made its modern reputation building aero engines, which was the business Bentley had come out of when he founded the company. Two firms, shaped by the same war, meeting over a bankruptcy 12 years later. The men in those negotiations would have understood one another perfectly. Then came the Press Association report, which appeared in the Times on the 24th of October 1931, on page 18. The Press Association understands that Messrs. Napier and Son, aero engine builders, have reached an agreement to take over Bentley Motors Limited, which is in voluntary liquidation. It is expected that the matter will come before the court within the next few days. Read that carefully in the language of 1931 and understand what it told the country. Not that Napier was interested, not that talks were underway. An agreement had been reached. The parties were settled. What remained was the court, which in a receivership is the body that confirms a sale. And the expectation was that this would happen within days. To the public, to the trade, to the press, and to Walter Owen Bentley, the matter was decided. The buyer was Napier. The only thing left was the formality. That word, court, is doing more work in the report than any reader would have noticed at the time. When a company is in receivership, The receiver's duty is to the creditors, and his obligation is to get the best price available for the assets. He does not simply honor a handshake. Until a court confirms a sale, a better offer can still be made, and if a better offer arrives, the receiver is more or less bound to take it. So the very sentence that told the country the matter was settled also described the door through which somebody else could still walk. Everybody read it as an announcement. It was an invitation, and at least one firm in England understood that perfectly. There was one man who might have been expected to fight for the outcome, and he had other business. Barnato had chaired the company for the best part of 6 years, and he had put more into it than any other person alive. Whatever happened next at Cricklewood, he was no longer part of it. And then there is the matter of Barnato and New York. Bentley believed, and stated in his own account of these events, that Barnato had been in New York and had bought a substantial holding of shares in Rolls-Royce there, shortly before withdrawing his support from Bentley Motors. That is his belief, recorded by him, and it has never been proved. It should be weighed as what it is, the suspicion of a man who had just lost everything, held about the man who had stopped paying. It is not evidence, but he put it in writing, and the fact that he did tells you what that winter did to him. What is documented, and not in dispute, is the sequence of the sale itself, and it did not go the way the Times had described, because there was another party in the process, not a motor manufacturer, not an engineering firm, not a name anybody in the trade recognised at all. It was called the British Central Equitable Trust. It had no factories, no designs, no racing history, and no visible reason to want a bankrupt motorcar company in Cricklewood. The name itself is a small masterpiece. British, which reassures. Central, which suggests substance without describing any. Equitable, which promises fairness. Trust, which is the last word in the whole of commercial English that anybody questions. 4 words, chosen with care, and not one of them tells you a single thing about who is behind them. Nobody at Napier knew what it was. Nobody at Cricklewood knew what it was. And that, precisely, was the point of it. Chapter 11. A name that meant nothing outbid them all. The British Central Equitable Trust had no cars, no factory, and no reason anyone could see to want a bankrupt motor company. Start with the motive, because it is documented and it is cold. Rolls-Royce had been disturbed by the 8 Litre. Bentley's new car had been placed directly into the market segment of the Phantom II, at a slightly higher price, with better performance. That was tolerable while Bentley Motors was failing, since a company in receivership sells nothing to anybody. It became intolerable the moment somebody proposed to rescue it. Napier's bid was the danger. Napier had money, factories, and industrial competence. A Bentley design office funded by Napier, building cars that outran the Phantom II, would have been a permanent competitor at the top of the British market. So Rolls-Royce decided to buy Bentley Motors, and the reason was to stop it existing as a rival. There was an obvious difficulty. If Rolls-Royce bid openly, 2 things would follow immediately. Napier would understand exactly what was at stake and fight for it, and the price would climb, because the value of any asset rises the moment its owner learns that a great rival wants it badly. The solution was concealment. Rolls-Royce's agents entered the process behind an entity called the British Central Equitable Trust, specifically so that Napier would not be alerted and the price would not be inflated. A firm of impeccable reputation, whose entire commercial identity rested on being the most trustworthy manufacturer in the world, bought its principal competitor from a receiver under a name chosen so that nobody would know who was buying. Nothing about that was illegal. Buyers act through agents and nominees every day, and always have. But the purpose here was specific, and it is documented, to keep Napier in the dark and to keep the price down. The men at Derby were not merely being discreet. They had worked out that the truth about their identity was worth money, and they kept it back. At the last moment, the trust topped Napier's bid. The winning figure was £125,000. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is the measure of everything. £125,000 bought the works at Cricklewood, the showrooms in Cork Street, the service station at Kingsbury, the tooling, the drawings, the unsold stock, the racing record of 5 Le Mans victories, and the Bentley name. The company had lost £136,220 over its lifetime. It sold for less than it had lost. At a chassis price of £1,850, the entire firm went for roughly what 68 8-litres would have cost before a single body was fitted to any of them. Rolls-Royce announced the acquisition on the 20th of November, 1931. That announcement is where this film began. A cocktail party in London. A woman who did not know the man she was standing near. A remark she half heard about a company that had recently taken over Bentley. Her hostess supplying the name Arthur Sidgreaves. And then the question, put to her husband at home, of who exactly that was. He is the managing director of Rolls-Royce. Walter Owen Bentley learned that his own company had been bought by his greatest rival because his wife went to a party and somebody there could not keep his mouth shut. And there is one more detail, smaller than all the others and colder. The old company had never troubled to register the Bentley trademark. In 12 years of building cars, winning at Le Mans, and putting the name on every radiator that left Cricklewood, nobody there had ever filed the paperwork to own it. It had not occurred to them that it mattered. The name was on the cars. The name was theirs. What was there to register? Rolls-Royce took immediate steps to remedy that omission. That is the whole story in one sentence. The new owner filed the registration that the founders had never got round to, and from that moment, the word Bentley was the legal property of the company at Derby. He had given them the aluminium piston during the war. He had given them his customers in 1930. And now, through simple inattention, he had given them his name. There is one more name on the far side of that transaction, and it is the one that hurt. Rolls-Royce set up a new subsidiary to hold what it had bought, called Bentley Motors 1931 Limited. Woolf Barnato was invited to become a director of it. Consider the shape of that. In July, he had told the lenders he could not meet the debts. In November, the company he had chaired was sold to its greatest rival for £125,000. And by the end of it, he had a seat on the board of the new operation, while the engineer whose name was on the door had a 3-year employment contract and no say in anything. Whether Barnato engineered any part of that is not provable, and this film will not claim it. Bentley himself believed, and said so, that Barnato had bought Rolls-Royce shares in New York shortly before withdrawing his support. There is no evidence for it beyond his word. What is documented is the outcome. The man with the money ended up on the board, and the man with the name ended up on the payroll. Cricklewood was closed during 1932. The machinery went. Production of cars called Bentley moved to Rolls-Royce premises at Derby and, after the war, to Crewe. Everything was sold off except some 8-litre chassis, which were taken up to Derby. But there was one asset in that sale, which was not machinery, not premises, and not a trademark. It had been listed with the rest of them. And in the weeks that followed, 2 great engineering companies went to court to argue about who had bought it. It was him. Chapter 12. Sold with the showrooms and the service station. The inventory listed Cork Street, the service station at Kingsbury, the works at Cricklewood, and the services of Walter Owen Bentley. Napier disputed it. Having lost the company, they went to court over the man, arguing that his personal services should come to them. They were unsuccessful. The court confirmed that Rolls-Royce had bought the contract along with everything else. So the position, settled by a judge, was this: Walter Owen Bentley was obliged to go and work for the firm that had concealed its identity in order to buy his company, close his factory, and take his name. The contract ran from the 1st of May 1932 to the end of April 1935. 3 years. He went in hoping. He believed, or made himself believe, that Rolls-Royce would give him a design team. He was one of the most accomplished engine designers in the country, and they had just acquired him at some expense. It was not an unreasonable thing to hope. The first meeting with Henry Royce ended it. Royce opened by saying that he believed Bentley was a commercial man. Bentley replied that he was not, really. Primarily, he said, he supposed he was more of a technical specialist. Royce said, "You are not an engineer then, are you?" And Bentley, who had shoveled 7 tons of coal in a day on the footplate of a Great Northern Express, answered that he thought Royce had been a boy in the Great Northern running sheds at Peterborough, a little before he himself had been a premium apprentice at Doncaster. It is a marvellous reply, and it changed nothing. 2 men from the same railway, one of whom now owned the other's name. What followed was 3 years of careful, deliberate uselessness. Rolls-Royce kept him in London and on the continent. They used him as a liaison between customers and the works at long range. They sent him to test drive at Brooklands and on long runs across Europe and through the Alps. He was, in the practical sense, employed as a driver. There was a new car coming, a smaller Bentley for Derby to build, a 3.5 litre announced in October 1933. Bentley was permitted only to comment on the design of it. He was kept away from the team that made it. In time, he managed to start reporting in person to the design offices at Derby, and he made friends there, among them Harry Grills and Stuart Tresillian. He admired what those men achieved. That is the measure of him. Sequestered from the team, building the car that carried his own surname, he looked at their work and thought it was good. Rolls-Royce marketed the new car as the silent sports car. That phrase is worth hearing through his ears. Every word in it is a correction of him. Silent applied to a marque that had made its name on cars strong enough to run flat out for 24 hours. Sports applied to a machine built at Derby by men he was not allowed to sit with. And the badge on the front of it was his surname. The Derby cars were good. He said so himself, which is more than most men in his position would have managed. But they were somebody else's answer to a question he had spent his whole life asking. Meanwhile, the rest of his life came apart. In the winter of 1931 going into 1932, his wife divorced him. It was Poppy, the society woman he had married in 1920, who disliked factories, and who had come home from that cocktail party with the news that his company had been sold. She was the second of his 3 wives. The first, Leonie, had died in the influenza epidemic of 1919. And then he lost his car. He owned an 8 litre, personally. It was the last and greatest thing he had designed, the car that had brought Rolls-Royce down on him, and it was his own. He was asked to return it. The founder of Bentley Motors, in the winter after the sale, had no motor car at all. Word of it reached Lord Rootes of the Rootes Group, who had no obligation to Bentley of any kind. Rootes arranged for him to test a new Hillman each weekend, so that the man who had built the fastest cars in Britain would have something to drive. It is the kindest act in this entire story, and it is also the most humiliating fact in it, and those 2 things are inseparable. He served out the contract. He left at the end of April 1935, and he described the feeling afterwards in one word: freedom. He was 46 years old, and his name belonged to somebody else. Chapter 13. The house burned, and nobody rebuilt it. The fire began on the upstairs landing beside the nursery, and by morning, Ardenrun was a roofless ruin. It was the 21st of January 1933. 14 months after the sale of Bentley Motors, the house that the Bentley money had lived in went up. By the time the brigade arrived, the place was well alight. By morning, there was nothing to save. The house that Ernest Newton had built, the house a critic had said would look better as the years went on given proper upkeep, was a shell with the sky showing through it. It was never rebuilt. There was no reason to rebuild it. There was no entail, no ancestral obligation, no village that depended on it, and nobody buried in the church expecting the family to carry on. It was a rich young man's house, and the rich young man was 37 and could simply live somewhere else. He moved into his flat in Grosvenor Square, then bought the flat next door to give himself more room. Later, he built a new house at Englefield Green, on the edge of Windsor Great Park, and the architect was Robert Lutyens, son of Sir Edwin. It was long, low and white, in a style people called ranch, with 25 bedrooms, most of them with their own bathrooms, a swimming pool, a squash court, and 20 acres of garden. It took 7 years to finish. When the war came, the White House was judged a tempting and conspicuous target from the air, and the whole thing was repainted in camouflage colours. That is the arc of Ardenrun, from an architectural notice about proper upkeep to a night fire in a nursery corridor in 24 years. Great houses of that era were falling all over England, brought down by the death duties introduced in 1894, by the People's Budget of 1909, by the agricultural depression, and by the losses of the First World War. Ardenrun died differently. It burned by accident. And then it stayed dead, because the money that built its way of life had never been rooted in the ground it stood on. Diamonds do not hold a house in place. The men who had raced down that drive were going too, and going fast. Glenn Kidston, who had won Le Mans with Barnato in 1930, was dead by the 5th of May, 1931. He had flown from Netheravon in Wiltshire to Cape Town, breaking records on the way, and then crashed in the Drakensberg Mountains of South Africa. He was 32. Clive Dunphy died at Brooklands in 1932 in the 500-mile race. He was driving old number 1, the Speed 6 that had won Le Mans twice, by then rebuilt with an 8-litre engine for the outer circuit. Passing Earl Howe's Bugatti, he went too high on the banking and put a wheel over the lip. The car went over the top, cartwheeled, struck a large tree, and fell down through the trees to the road below. He was thrown out and killed instantly. Tim Birkin, who had fought for the blower against Bentley's judgment and lost that argument on the track, died in 1933. At the Tripoli Grand Prix in May, he was driving Bernard Rubin's Maserati and burned his arm. The burn became septicemia. He died 5 weeks later. 3 of them, in 3 consecutive years, in a mountain range, on a banking and in a hospital bed. Woolf Barnato lived on into a different world. When the Second War came, he joined the Royal Air Force, and at 44, he was too old to fly, so they commissioned him as a wing commander with responsibility for the defence of airfields across southern England. He worked with the Ministry of Aircraft Production. The boy who had inherited a diamond fortune before he could walk spent his 40s guarding runways. In July 1948, he finally went into hospital for a minor abdominal operation that he had been putting off for years. The operation succeeded. 4 days later, he died of a thrombosis on the 27th of July, 1948. He was 52. They buried him at Englefield Green. At the funeral, a Bentley Le Mans Speed 6, loaded with flowers, was driven to the graveside. It was the right car. He had won Le Mans in a Speed 6 twice, and in that model, the company had built the best thing it ever made. He had put more than £200,000 into the company, and in July 1931, he had told the lenders he could not meet the debts. And both of those facts were true of the same man. The engineer, meanwhile, was still working, and he was about to discover the last and strangest consequence of never having filed a piece of paper in 1919. Chapter 14. He went to court for permission to be called by his own name. In 1944, an advertisement appeared on the cover of the Tatler with one word above and another below. Go back to 1935 for a moment. In June of that year, a Lagonda won the 24 Hours of Le Mans. A week later, Lagonda itself was rescued from receivership by a man called Alan P. Good, who bought the company by outbidding Rolls-Royce for it. Which means that in 1935, somebody finally beat Rolls-Royce in an auction, and the prize was the firm that would give Walter Owen Bentley his freedom back. Good persuaded Bentley to join the new board as technical director, and Bentley went, taking with him the majority of the racing department staff from Rolls-Royce. At Staines, he was finally free of interference, and what he built there was arguably the finest thing he ever designed. He put Stuart Tresillian in charge of a new engine, and in 1937, Lagonda launched a V12 of 4,480 cubic centimetres, delivering 180 brake horsepower, said to pull from 7 miles an hour to 105 in top gear. At the New York Motor Show in 1939, the Lagonda Rapide was the most expensive car in the building at $8,900. So Lagonda advertised its cars, and it advertised the man who had designed them. In August 1944, the advertisements appeared on the front covers of the Tatler and the Illustrated London News, and in November of that year, on the front cover of the Sphere, and, in a different form, in the Motor. The judge who eventually examined them described what a reader's eye actually took in. The words which catch the eye, he said, are Lagonda above and Bentley below. Rolls-Royce, through its Bentley subsidiary, sued. Trademark infringement, they said, and passing off. Walter Owen Bentley counterclaimed. He asked the court for an injunction to stop the new Bentley company from interfering with the use of his own name by Lagonda. He had grounds. There had been an agreement that if he left Rolls-Royce within 10 years of the 31st of March, 1932, he would have certain rights over the use of his name. He had left on the 30th of April, 1935, comfortably inside the 10 years. The case ran for 8 days in court, not counting judgment. Rolls-Royce won. Now correct the story that is usually told, because the truth is worse than the myth. It is often said that Walter Owen Bentley was banned from putting his own name on a motor car in 1931. That is a compression of something slower and stranger. Nobody forbade him anything in 1931. What happened was that his personal services were sold along with the furniture and fought over in court by 2 companies, neither of which was him. That the name he had never registered was registered by the buyer immediately, that he then worked 3 years for the new owner, kept away from the car that carried his surname, and sent off to drive through the Alps. And that, when, 9 years after leaving, his name appeared under somebody else's on the cover of a magazine, the firm that owned it took him to court and beat him. No villain raises his voice anywhere in that sequence. It is all done with correspondence, filings, and counsel's opinion. A name is the one thing a man believes cannot be taken from him, and it turns out it can be taken with a registration form and 8 days of argument. He worked on. After the war, he designed a 2.6-litre twin overhead camshaft straight 6, and when David Brown bought Lagonda, largely to obtain Bentley's engineering, he dropped that engine straight into the Aston Martin DB2. It powered Lagondas and Aston Martins until 1959. He then moved to Armstrong Siddeley, worked on the Sapphire, and retired. In 1947, he agreed to become patron of the Bentley Drivers Club, and he held that position until he died. He died on Friday the 13th of August, 1971, in Woking, at 82. The Times gave him a long obituary on the 16th of August, and then printed 2 more contributions over the following week. One of them, from a man who had worked with the cars and their owners, said this: "In the eyes of those who own, have owned, or aspire to own, one of the 3,040 Bentley cars, designed and built by the old Bentley Company under the leadership of W.O., he was admired and respected. Indeed," he wrote, "I think loved is not too strong a word, for to know his cars was to know him." And then the line that settles it. During his working life, W.O. suffered a series of ups and downs, which might have broken a lesser man. 3,061 chassis left Cricklewood, and 3,040 of them became finished cars. A great many are still running, kept and maintained at values that would have astonished every man in this story. Old Number 7 survives. Old Number 1 survives. The name is on a factory at Crewe today, owned now by a German manufacturer, worth more than anybody in 1931 could have calculated. But go back, finally, to a young man in an office in 1912 holding a paperweight. He picked it up because it was light. Everything came out of that. The engines that kept pilots alive over France, the £8,000 that started a company, the 5 wins at Le Mans, the house in Surrey with a bar in the cellar, the 8 Litre priced above the Phantom II, the concealed bidder, the trademark filed by strangers. He owned that idea outright, briefly, before he told anybody. It is the only thing in this entire story that was never sold, listed, litigated, or registered by somebody else. Everything else had a price, and the men at Derby found it. £125,000 for a factory, a service station, a showroom, 5 victories, a name, and a man. If you have enjoyed this one, subscribe, because there are more stories like it than the badge on any bonnet would care to admit. And I would like to know what you make of Woolf Barnato. Did he simply do what any sensible rich man would do when the money ran out? Or did he owe the man whose name was on the building rather more than he gave him?